Pop quiz. How many times does the word twin appear in Elden Ring? We have the twin prodigies, Miquella and Malenia, the twin omens, Morgott and Mohg. Rellana is a twin who wields both twin swords and a spell called the Twin Moons. There's twinned armor, twin blades, the twin birds, and the twin maiden husks. To answer the question, there are 10 full pages of results if you type twin into one of the game's wikis, and 400 results if you type it into the other. Why? Why is Elden Ring obsessed with twins and dualities? The answer will give us both insight into the dualities we've named, and allow us to find dualities that are hidden in shadows. We will find that duality connects to everything in Elden Ring, and allows us to tie together the most critical parts of the game's lore. So once again, come with me, and let's discuss. As usual, this episode will contain spoilers for Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree. But then, many of the points I'm about to make are hard to arrive at even after playing the entire game, so it's really up to you if you want your lore in advance. If you haven't seen the first 2 episodes of this series, I do recommend watching them in order, but I will review major concepts as they come up. If you are watching this video first, there are a couple things you need to know about this series. I am not going to zoom in on a single topic in this video, but zoom out and discuss the big picture, how we can find and interpret major threads of theme and meaning within the game. Because of that, this video will be dense. I will be dropping major lore insights repeatedly, so feel free to pause occasionally and digest. I could easily have divided this video into a dozen smaller ones, and probably garnered more views that way. But that's not me. I'm the guy who called his series The Grand Unified Theory of Elden Ring, and that's what I plan to deliver. So without further ado, it's time to duel. Here's a question that occurred to me when I first played Elden Ring. If Marika is a full-fledged god with the power of the Elden Ring at her disposal, then how did the Carian sorcerers manage to fight her armies to a draw? There's a sense of balance between these two factions, even though the Golden Order is said to dominate the lands between. In order to make sense of this, let's back up and consider a series of related dualities that exist in multiple cultural traditions from around the world, including both Western Hermetic alchemy and Eastern philosophy. On the one side of this set of dualities, we see associations between the moon, feminine energy, the spirit, water, and silver. On the other side, we see the opposing energies of the sun, the masculine, the body, fire, and gold. This set of dualities also aligns with the Chinese concept of yin and yang, or in Japanese, inyo, the characters for which literally mean shade and light. Some of these associations are fairly intuitive, such as a connection between the moon and water, since the motion of the moon leads to the rise and fall of the tides. Still, it's fascinating how universal many of these associations are, and Elden Ring has a habit of drawing ideas from multiple different traditions and synthesizing them into its own mythology. When we look at these associations side by side, we can begin to understand that these related dualities are really a single duality, a division of reality into 2 types of energy, which manifest in different ways, and which recombine to create the world. This is the underlying meaning of the yin-yang symbol, most often associated with Taoism. Seemingly opposing forces within the world are in fact interdependent, and neither can exist without the other. No light without shadow, as they say. In Elden Ring, we can see these associations everywhere, but especially in Liurnia of the Lakes. Liurnia is a land completely flooded by water, ruled by a matriarchal faction, the carrion sorcerers, and full of people who revere the moon and are practiced in the art of summoning spirits. This is also the first area where we find albinorics, artificial life forms with silver blood. This land of silver reflection, serving as an equal opposite to the Erd Tree's golden light, thematically matches with the metaphysical balance between yin and yang. However, there is something about this duality that doesn't seem to add up, because Marika, God Queen of the Golden Order, is female. How does she represent the yang, the masculine energy of the world? What's more, the game heavily hints to us that she is somehow related to the denizens of the night-worshipping eternal cities, and she may even be the spirit tuner that Hugh is indebted to. Those are all connections to the yin side of the duality, aren't they? This discrepancy leads us back to one of the major revelations from a prior video, that Marika and her husband Radagon are a single person. That is, Marika is both male and female. She is an alchemical rebus, and her status as a unity of opposites is directly connected to her status as a god over the lands between. Indeed, as a being of merged male and female qualities, Marika should be able to represent the balance of this duality all on her own. And yet the Golden Order raises up some citizens and concepts for veneration, while denigrating others. The world is fixed in an unbalanced state, because Marika has aspects of herself that she has suppressed and hidden. Through the Erd Tree, she is shining light on what she wants us to see, but to find the whole truth, we must also look into the shadow. The shadow is a recurring image in Elden Ring, but also a foundational concept in psychology, used by both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung to describe the unconscious aspects of the mind. For Freud, the shadow was largely synonymous with the id, the base animal instincts and desires that we all experience. In order to function in society, however, we need what Freud called the ego, the ability to separate the id from more productive and acceptable thoughts. Finally, Freud conceived of the superego as a set of guiding principles that direct the ego in choosing which thoughts to bring to the surface and which to suppress. In Elden Ring, we see this connection between shadows and the id represented by characters like Blythe and Malekith. They are both called Shadows of the Empyrean, vassals given to Ranni and Marika, who appear as beast-human hybrids. We first encounter Blythe deep in the woods, howling at the moon like a feral creature, but are taught how to interact with him by Kale, by snapping our fingers. This sound summons him down to us, where he speaks with surprising civility and restraint. Despite his bestial nature, he is ultimately a subservient aspect of Ranni, a being that is accustomed to being ordered about, and made to suppress his nature. Marika has a similar relationship with her shadow, Malekith. She ordered Malekith to take the Rune of Death and hide it away in the crumbling city beyond time, Far Missoula. When we encounter Malekith, however, he's in the guise of a cleric, his form covered from head to toe, bound by a duty to recover the lost shards of the Rune of Death that were stolen from him. As we progress his storyline and feed him death, we see his bestial nature emerge, and he attacks us without provocation, needing to be physically suppressed by the player before we can once again speak civilly. We eventually have a similar interaction with Blythe, for despite his loyal and valiant qualities, it was the two fingers that played the role of ego to Blythe's id that separated him out and suppressed his violent instincts. Perhaps this is why he responded to our finger snap when we first met him. He was created to be a servant to the fingers. At the end of Ranni's questline, however, she slays her pair of fingers that sought to control her fate, and in their absence, there is no ego to control Blythe. Thus, the next time we see him, he has become feral, and his bestial fury is unleashed at us. FromSoft really has a habit of forcing us to put down good boys. So in short, the base game is very Freudian. But the other founder of modern psychology, Carl Jung, had a different perspective on the shadow. The shadow, according to Jung, is the aspect of ourselves that is difficult for us to look at, the aspects of self that contradict how we want to see ourselves. In other words, as we develop a sense of identity, we tend to elevate the inner thoughts and feelings that reinforce this sense of self, while repressing the thoughts and feelings that conflict with it. According to Jung, repression of the shadow is unhealthy, a stopgap in order to get along in society, whereas we should instead aspire to achieve shadow integration, a state of full self-acceptance. It is this Jungian conception of the shadow that we see on display in The Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, for the realm of shadow contains all of the truths that Marika wishes to keep hidden, all of the dark truths that she refuses to acknowledge. When we first arrive in this land, we see in the sky great veils draped over the realm, a very literal image to represent this land being covered up. What's more, these veils may look familiar, for they match the draping cloth over Marika's own bed in the golden capital of Leyndell. With this in mind, the DLC can be understood as an exploration of the skeletons in Marika's closet, or if you want to be even more literal, Marika's dirty laundry. We see this relationship to the shadow reinforced in Mesmer, Marika's child, who she hid within the realm of shadow. Mesmer was born with an abyssal serpent inside of him, and Marika suppressed this aspect of her son by replacing his eye with a false one, an eye that sees through the grace of gold. When Mesmer removes this golden seal, the repressed shadow erupts from within him. So we have a sense of what the shadow represents thematically within Elden Ring, but what are light and shadow in a more literal sense? In our world, light reveals things obscured by shadow. It makes them perceivable and knowable. In Elden Ring, I think we can go a step further and say that light renders things more real than they were before. I claimed in a prior video that the language of creation was visual in the world of Elden Ring, that it was shape and motion. The written version of this language is called a language of light, and we see in various contexts that light forms runes and can bind things and make them real. We see this, for instance, in several catacombs that are filled with enemies made of shadow. These enemies are dangerous, but cannot be harmed until you expose them to a golden light. In our world, light can dispel the creatures of our imagination that lurk in unseen corners by showing us the true shape of the world around us. And in Elden Ring, light forces these ambiguous, half-real aspects of the world to assume a fixed form. If light can be a kind of language, then perhaps it can also serve to name things, to draw a boundary line of identity around what something is and what it isn't. And this is how an amorphous thing comes to be fixed, by having light cast upon it. All light, however, comes from a source, and the nature of that source affects the character of the light itself. So let's consider the most important source of light in our world, and the diminished role it plays in the lands between. The sun is one of the most common objects of reverence in our world. Across cultures and time, the sun is a giver of life and warmth. In Elden Ring, however, the sun's role has been usurped by the Erdtree, which is the brightest thing in the sky, both night and day. In fact, the presence of the sun is subtle enough that you can find Reddit threads where players ask whether or not the sun even exists within the game. Nonetheless, we know that in the past, the sun was an object of worship, as noted by items like the Sunrealm Shield. We can assume that before the Erdtree took on this role, the sun was indeed a giver of life and golden light, and the Erdtree's role is derivative of this traditional role of the sun. So what about the moon? You might think that if the sun represents life, then the moon represents death. But that's not quite right. If we think about the innate qualities of the moon, especially as represented in Elden Ring, one theme comes up most clearly: reflection. After all, the moon doesn't generate its own light. It reflects the light of the sun. Moreover, in places where the moon is venerated, such as the moon-gazing grounds in the Carian Manor, we see pools of water. The moon was viewed by the people who most respected it through its reflection in the water. And this theme of reflection is a wordplay, for the primary metaphysical significance of the moon is as a symbol of memory. Consider that all of the memory stones found in the game are said to be fragments of a moon that once hung above an eternal city, and the Moon of Noxtella talisman similarly increases your memory slots. So, where the light of the sun gives rise to the present and the physical, the reflected light of the moon connects to the past and the world of the mind. This is where spirits come into play, for Elden Ring makes it abundantly clear that after death, memories remain. We can use a spirit calling bell to summon spirits to aid us as they recall battles past. And the phenomenon of those who live in death demonstrates that death of the body and death of the spirit are separate things. In the age of the Erd Tree, the dead are intended to be buried at the tree's roots so that they can be reabsorbed, body and soul, into the Erd Tree and reborn. But this is only true of the current era, and is a reality that is already starting to break down when we enter the lands between. Indeed, both Ranni's story and Miquella's story involve them sacrificing their flesh and the fate that was tied to it in order to pursue an alternative, spiritual destiny. We noted that water is associated with the moon, and we can also see that it is closely tied to spirits. As you wander the lands between, just look, and you'll see that disproportionately, spirits manifest around bodies of water. Why are the ancestral followers in the lower part of the Shifer River spirits, while the ones higher up near Nokron are physical? Because the ones below are next to the river. The earliest encounters with those who live in death in Limgrave occur in a river and in a flooded ruin. The field bosses that reanimate those who live in death are boatmen called Tibia Mariners. The default, non-hostile spirit we encounter throughout the game is in the shape of a jellyfish. Even our spirit steed, Torrent, has a water-themed name. I want to acknowledge Nameless Singer here, who gives a really solid set of associations between water and death in a recent video, but I'm going to go a step further. I think that water in Elden Ring is a medium for the spirit, and therefore the mind. Water is connected to death because it is connected to the immortal spirit, and flowing water in particular can lead spirits to pass on, while stagnant water can leave the dead trapped. This association between water, the past, and the world of the mind has appeared in past FromSoft games as well. For instance, the opening cinematic for Dark Souls 2 features the protagonist approaching ruins by the water, and then within the water, we see a reflection of those ruins as they appeared in the distant past. In Bloodborne, water is used several times to indicate entering a space within the mind. The role of water in Elden Ring has shifted slightly, but the game is definitely playing off of similar imagery and associations. Reflection and depth are visual as well as linguistic metaphors for the internal world. Notably, living things all have water inside them, including us, and including trees. We can, in fact, see that the Erd Tree's roots reach all the way down into the deep-root depths, drinking from an underground river that, much like the river Styx in Greek mythology, seems that it once was used to ferry the departed on from this world. If that's all true, it may be that the Erd Tree harbors memories precisely because it has co-opted the role of the afterlife, just as it has co-opted the role of the sun. All lives and afterlives now must flow through the Erd Tree, trapped in a cycle of rebirth within the lands of between. In order to understand what the alternative is, we need to better understand the concept of death. There's something paradoxical about death in Elden Ring. In our world, we understand death to be the end of life, but in the lands between, there are also those who live in death. There are spirits who seem to persist long after their bodies have perished. What's more, we are told that the Rune of Death, or Destined Death, was removed from the Elden Ring, and yet things still die all the time. So what does the Rune of Death do exactly? In order to make any sense of this, we have to recognize that there are two fundamentally different things that Elden Ring means by death. There is the end of bodily life, and there is that which comes after, the eternal life of the spirit. We know that in the Age of the Erd Tree, these two meanings are merged, because when a person dies, their body and soul are intended to be returned to the Erd Tree. In the age before that, however, death was very different. We get hints about older practices of death from several sources. There are the rivers running under the earth, the Shifra and Ainsel, which carry coffins along a journey to a destination that has since been cut off. There are the Deathrite birds, which supposedly used to burn the dead in ghost flame. And we find in the Shadowkeep burning funeral barges, evocative of a Viking ritual. These images associate death with a combination of fire and water, and all point in a similar direction. Death prior to the Erd Tree was about liberating the soul from the body and allowing it to pass on. But pass on to where? We are given the answer in the opening scene of the game. For we return from death to the lands between by crossing the sea from the west and arriving at the Chapel of Anticipation along the western coast. For those bound by grace, death goes nowhere. They are reborn into the lands between. But once the Rune of Death has been unleashed, souls will once again be able to depart in the direction of the setting sun. With this in mind, we have a new way of understanding destined death. Notably, in English, the word destiny shares a root with destination. Thus, destined death is not just a death that is the fate of all living things, but a death that leads you somewhere else. In turn, perhaps this helps to explain why the game is set in a place called the Lands Between. Between what? Well, consider that we know of two great runes that were removed from the Elden Ring before the Shattering. The Rune of Death, which was hidden in Far Missoula, and the Rune of the Unborn, which was inside the Amber Egg Radagon gave to Renala. In between birth and death. That is the extent of time one was intended to live in the Lands Between, prior to the rise of the Golden Order and the sealing of destined death. In order to create an eternal order within the Lands Between, these two concepts had to be removed from the Elden Ring. There could be no souls leaving and no new souls arriving. Now we may also be able to understand the opposite of destined death, the Eclipse. The Eclipse was really hard for me to make sense of, because the sun clearly represents life, and so the sun being an eclipse would mean, well, less life, right? So why does the game tell us that the eclipse, the sun drained of color, is the protective star of soulless demigods, keeping destined death at bay? Notably, the word eclipse in this context may not mean the sun is being specifically occluded by the moon. The relevant part is that it has been somehow drained of color, though that doesn't immediately help us answer the question. I have to give credit here to another creator, The Alchemist, for reminding me of something that can bridge the gap: the myth of the phoenix. You've probably heard of the phoenix. It's a legendary bird that is said to pass away in flames, but then to rise again from the ashes. The thing is, the phoenix originated as part of sun worship, for the sun also dies each day and is reborn the next in a fiery red sky. The point is that the sun can represent both life and death as it moves across the sky and sets. And the red hue of the dusk, leading souls to the west, is the color of destined death. This is the color of the death flame wielded by Malekith and by the Black Knife Assassins, who each infused a fragment of the Rune of Death into their blades. Meanwhile, the Godskin Apostles wield a god-killing flame that has no color, and the game tells us that this flame has lost its true power now that death is sealed away. In other words, the flame of the Godskin Apostles is supposed to be the color of dusk, the color of destined death, but it has been drained of color, like the sun in Eclipse. There is another flame that has been similarly drained of color in the current order, Ghost Flame. We see Ghost Flame in the game as a pale white-blue color, but the Grave Violet item says that this flower is the hue of Ghost Flame. If the color of the setting sun is the color of destined death, then it would follow that Ghost Flame, which is meant to be used in funerary ritual after death, would be associated with the color of twilight. Twilight isn't a single specific color, but it often appears somewhere in the muted blue-purple range. And given the Grave Violet description, it seems that Ghost Flame used to have a more purple hue. A poetic word for twilight is the gloaming, and thus it's reasonable to assume that the mysterious figure called the Gloam-Eyed Queen once had an eye reminiscent of the hue of twilight. We can also assume that the Deathrite birds were themselves once much more colorful. In any case, if the sun rising and setting is connected metaphysically to birth and death, then we can see the importance of its role being usurped by the Erd Tree. The Erd Tree shines night and day, guiding all souls bound by grace to stay in the lands between eternally. In this context, let's consider the moon once more, alongside a Buddhist concept from the last episode, the Wheel of Samsara. I mentioned that the Wheel of Samsara represents the eternal cycle of rebirth that a Buddhist seeks to free themselves from. What I didn't mention, because I am sneaky, is that traditional depictions of this wheel also include the Buddha pointing toward the moon to represent an alternative to earthly reincarnation. This is likely one of the inspirations for Rani's ending to the game. She seeks to break the cycle and find an alternative to the perpetual suffering of the Golden Order by going on a journey led by the Dark Moon. The phrase Dark Moon is synonymous with the New Moon, which represents the end of one cycle and the start of something else. Dark Moon sounds way cooler, though. So following this trail of dualities has led us to better understand the meaning of destined death and the sun and moon. But what exactly is in the west? Where do you end up if you actually cross the sea? When I started the DLC, I couldn't decide exactly what the Realm of Shadow was. Was it a pocket of reality where Marika hid her secrets? Maybe a distant land connected to the origins of life? Could it be the realm of the dead? Now that I've finished the DLC and had time to consider, I think the answer is all of the above. In order to get there, I have to bring up J.R.R. Tolkien. Claiming that a fantasy story is inspired by Tolkien isn't exactly a revelation, but some of the connections between Elden Ring and the Silmarillion are just too extensive for us to ignore. So, a quick overview of relevant Tolkien lore. In an ancient age, long before the events of Lord of the Rings, angelic beings called the Valar established their home in a land far to the west of Middle-earth, the Undying Lands. They created two magical radiant trees, one gold and one silver, which illuminated the entire land and produced magical dew made of light. The trees were eventually drained of their light and destroyed by Morgoth, the Betrayer, and the shadowy spirit Ungoliant. But the remnants of these trees were fashioned into the sun and moon, and seeds from Telperion, the silver tree, were taken to Numenor, and later brought by the Numenorians to Middle-earth, where one of these seeds grew into the white tree of Gondor. So, does any of that sound familiar? Recall that Marika is said to be from a race of unusually long-lived people that come from outside the Lands Between, called the Numen. When the game came out, much less when I was a kid, you had to be a pretty intense Tolkien nerd to know what a Numenorian was. But now that Rings of Power has been released, I suspect that more people will be able to understand how Numen could be an homage to Tolkien. With this in mind, consider the seed talismans found at Finger Ruins. The seed talismans say that they harken back to the birth of the Erd Tree, implying that Marika received seeds, whether literal or metaphorical, in what is now the Land of Shadow, and brought those seeds across the sea to the Land Between, to plant in the center of a city that was to be her capital, to grow a radiant tree that was the symbol of her divine authority. The parallel is just too spot on, except of course for the fact that Marika is playing the role of Numenorian and the role of Morgoth in this analogy, but we can't all be perfect. So I was tempted to leave that joke intact, but actually, the fact that Marika is serving two contradictory roles in this analogy fits with her role as a union of opposites in Elden Ring. Duality is the theme of this episode, after all. In any case, what does this suggest about the Realm of Shadow? Well, the Valar are nowhere to be found, but I do believe that this is a land that has long existed to the west of the Lands Between, and was somehow connected to the afterlife. How can we know that? Well, aside from all of the grave and spirit imagery covering every inch of the DLC, there is a smoking gun, namely, the suppressing pillar. No NPCs or other items direct you toward this tower, but if you reach the top of it, there is a plaque, which reads, "The very center of the Lands Between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed." This is about as overt as Elden Ring could possibly be about the identity of the Realm of Shadow, but there are a couple of things to dissect about these words. Firstly, this plaque isn't in the Lands Between, so what does that first half mean? Presumably, it means that this spot is metaphysically connected, or perhaps was once even physically connected, to the center of the Lands Between. Okay, so then what's in the very center of the Lands Between? That's debatable, but I think there are really just two candidates. The center of the Lands Between is either the middle of this giant lake, where there is a suspicious cloud on the map covering something up, or it's the Erd Tree. We know that underneath the Erd Tree there are the Deeproot Depths, which are connected to rivers that transport coffins. So whether it's pointing there or to the center of the lake, the answer is that it's pointing to water. This leads to the second half of the plaque. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed. The phrase, wash up, is suggesting that passage to this realm is meant to be through the water. Somehow, waters near the center of the Lands Between were supposed to connect the dead to this land. Now, look at the Cerulean coast of the Realm of Shadow. There are massive coffins, the size of seafaring barges, washed up on the shore. We are told that these coffins contain the remains of dead who could not find rest. What I take from this is that after the traditional passageway to the land was cut off, some became desperate to reach the afterlife and decided to cross the sea the hard way. Even upon reaching this place, the dead within these coffins are tainted somehow and still do not know proper rest, which is why they appreciate Saint Trina, whose nectar can grant them sleep, a rest that is akin to a proper death. All manners of death wash up here indeed. Identifying the Realm of Shadow as a realm of death also allows us to tie together multiple concepts in the lore. Removing Destined death from the Elden Ring eclipsing the sun, and casting a veil of shadow over the lands of the DLC were all a single action. The realm of shadow is now unreachable because Destined Death led people here. The sun is distant and pale in the sky because it can no longer redden and invoke its metaphysical purpose absent the Rune of Death. The reason Ghost Flame doesn't work correctly, and spirits are still trapped in ashes after being burned, is because Ghost Flame drew its power from Destined Death. This connection does a lot of conceptual work for us. So you may be wondering, if the Realm of Shadow is Elden Ring's version of the Undying Lands, in Afterlife for spirits, then why are there living things here too? Well, clearly there are, or at least were, ways to travel between these two lands. The giant coffin barges prove that it's possible, if difficult, to physically cross the sea, and dragons can presumably fly between these two places. But there may have been some kind of ritual way to travel to this land as well, for we get here by following Miquella. I won't go into detail about this ritual right now, because I'm at risk of getting very far off topic. But the point is, one way or another, people were able to seek out this land of spirits. We see this in Devonia, a Crucible Knight, who set out on a quest from the lands between to find the origins of the Crucible. Perhaps the Hornsent and the people of Ra similarly traveled to this land full of spiritual energy and chose to stay. After all, the energy of the Crucible was stronger here, and the boundary line between amorphous spirits and solid flesh was thinner. Speaking of which, there's one last item I want to draw your attention to: the larval tear. Not the one from the base game, but the special variant that can only be found in the Realm of Shadow, and only at night, in the midst of a circle of spirit graves. This item says that it's an exceptionally rare creature that burgeons from spirit graves, and that it's neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between. Somehow, the boundary lines between body and spirit, between life and death, are fuzzier in this land. Perhaps this is why the shamans, Marika's own people, lived here and communed with spirits. This could even be connected to the reason why their own flesh was so mutable, so capable of merging with the flesh of others. Transformation is clearly part of the domain of the spiral-shaped crucible, and despite their lack of horns, the shamans seemed to be more deeply connected to this energy than anyone else. And this brings us full circle, for the central role of duality in Elden Ring isn't to emphasize difference, but to show the connection between things that appear to be opposites. Thus, Morgott, born a reviled omen, is actually a descendant of the Golden Lineage, and wields the very anchor rune of the Great Elden Ring. Thus, Radagon, a heroic slayer of giants, also bears their distinctive red hair. Consider Miquella and Malenia. We might say that Malenia's rot is connected to stagnation and decay, whereas Miquella is connected to abundance and growth. On the other hand, we could note that Malenia's scarlet rot seems to grow and spread out of control, while Miquella is trapped in the body of a child, never to grow up. So which one is stagnant, and which one represents growth? The two concepts are inextricably entwined, or even twinned. Just as the iconic depiction of yin and yang shows that light is always paired with darkness, everything contains an aspect of its opposite. The world was created by division, and those divisions are reinforced by labels and identities. But identity is a double-edged sword. For every aspect of yourself that you elevate and shine light upon buries another equally true part of yourself within shadow. Happy New Year, everyone! I'm happy with how this episode turned out, but this was a challenging episode to write. due to the sheer number of different connections I could have brought up. If I went too far in any direction, however, I found the script running away from me, and I wanted to stay focused on the things that seemed most important. So, needless to say, there are plenty of interesting thoughts I ended up having to cut. I have realized that shorts don't really suit my verbose style very well, so I am contemplating trying out medium-sized videos between major episodes. I might label such videos between meanings as a nod to the law of causality, so keep an eye out for that and let me know if it sounds like a good idea. I also wanted to make a note about the various religious and philosophical concepts I keep making reference to. I bring up these concepts as tools to help us interpret Elden Ring, but I don't want to be misunderstood as promoting any particular religious or philosophical attitude. For example, I bring up the traditional divide between masculine and feminine energies in the context of yin and yang, but this concept has been used problematically in the past, to suggest that men contain a positive energy that gets drained out of them by contact with women, for example. That's not the only way to read yin and yang, of course, but it's a real one that some people have stood by. This is the danger of taking any single concept and committing to it, without putting it into the context of, everything else in the universe. So please, take such references as food for thought, rather than as dogma. As usual, I want to thank all of you for being so engaged and encouraging, and it really makes a difference to me when I see people notice little details or respond to ideas that I only implied and didn't have time to delve into fully. I appreciate all of you, and as usual, you can show your appreciation for me by liking, subscribing, and leaving comments that tell the algorithm that this is some engaging content. There is, of course, more to come. So until next time.